I am a female in her early 20s. I live in the U.S. in a desert state, a town in the middle of nowhere. I come from a military family, generations of Air Force and Army, and a grandfather who was involved in Project Blue Book. I was sitting alone in my house, playing some Gwent on PS4, when my little sister and her friend came rushing through the door. I jumped out of my skin. It was midnight, and no lights were on. My sister, let's call her Yellow, and her friend Brown, seemed a bit shaken and nervous, though she and her friend were laughing as if they were up to no good. I asked them what they were doing, and Yellow said, "We were out for a walk in the desert near the mountain." Keep in mind, my sister is 16. No reason for her and her 15-year-old friend to be out in the desert in the middle of the night. I was upset, but saw they were fine, so I shook it off. "What did you guys do?" Yellow and her friend looked at each other and went quiet. Her friend whispered, "Do we tell her?" And Yellow replied, "Nah, she won't believe us." And they walked into the kitchen without a further word. Needless to say, I wanted to know what was going on, so I followed and promptly asked, "Yellow, what's up? Don't make me go nuclear." Going nuclear was our code for telling Mom. Yellow just looked at me and said, "Fine, just don't call me crazy." I nodded in agreement. I was intrigued, though I was expecting a lie from my known liar of a sister. Me and Brown saw a bunch of weird, large tents, and they were occupied. She sounded excited, yet a bit scared. I didn't think much of it at first. I mean, people like to camp, right? But I will admit, the area she described didn't sound like a good place to camp. Coyotes and snakes everywhere. "So you saw some people camping. What of it?" Brown shook her head and calmly said, "Not camping tents. Big, big tents. Not a single vehicle parked nearby." I was now confused, and started to think that it was a lie. Who would go that far out near the mountains, set up huge tents, then drive away? "I thought you said there were people there?" I asked. "We saw one person walking around the camp, circling it slowly," Yellow replied. Then Brown's face went pale and annoyed before she spoke. "Yeah, then Yellow did something stupid and shouted at the camp." I quickly looked at Yellow, who looked guilty but simply laughed it off. "All I did was say, 'Hey, nice tent. No big deal.'" Brown shook her head. "Yeah, but then the guy stopped and slowly turned to where we were." She went quiet and they both started to visibly get creeped out. "And?" I asked, starting to get a creepy vibe as well. "I kid you not, Blue. This guy had no eyes or a nose. Just a big, crooked smile." Brown shuddered, and then said that this was the moment when they ran without a thought, hearing a coyote howling constantly as they ran, as if the animal was directly behind them. I told them not to go near there again, and they went about their night. Like I said, Yellow is a known liar, but Brown is not. Brown is the exact opposite of Yellow, honor student, religious, and not a bad bone in her body. She would even rat on Yellow whenever she tried lying around her. To be honest, if Brown wasn't with Yellow when this happened, I wouldn't have believed it. That night I swore I saw the same SUV drive by our house every single hour until the sun came up. After that night, things started getting weird in this town. About 3 days later, the house across from us echoed a blood-curdling scream, and it didn't sound human at all. Then there was a gunshot, and if it wasn't for the neighbors also hearing it, I would have thought I dreamt it. The thing is, multiple people heard the noises, and multiple times the police were called. No one showed. The next morning, the lady who lived in the house started moving her stuff into her van, but her boyfriend was nowhere in sight, which I thought was strange because those two were inseparable. They were the perfect college couple, plus they had just moved in. I talked to my neighbor about it while she was loading everything, and he told me that he had called the cops when he heard the gunshot, and what he told me freaked me out. Here's the conversation that he had with the 911 operator. Operator: police will be there in no more than 5 minutes, sir. Neighbor: thank you. Operator hangs up abruptly. 12 minutes pass. He sees 0 police in our area or at the house, calls again. Operator: 911, what is the emergency? Neighbor: yeah, I just called, gunshot and scream. I was told 5 minutes, and no one is here. The operator was silent. My neighbor said, hello? Operator: yes, sir, I have officers pulling into your area in 2 minutes. Neighbor: okay, I'm gonna stay on the... Hangs up again. Line. 15 minutes later and still no police. He calls again. Operator: 911, what's your emergency? Neighbor: yeah, it's me again. Where are the officers? Someone might be in danger. Operator: sir, calm down. What's your address? Neighbor: I have given it each time I've called, but fine. Gives address again. Operator: sir, the police are there, and have been for 20 minutes now. Neighbor: no, I'm looking at the road and all the houses. No cops. Operator: sir, stop prank calling. Hangs up. Now I thought that was just bizarre and unsettling, thinking about our lack of police. But just as he finished with the story, a car pulls in and slowly heads to the house. It was the same SUV that I saw, and not only that, but it was a police SUV. It didn't even stop. It just slowed down by each house, and then slowly drove by the college girl loading her stuff up. She froze and stared at the cop car, and only continued when it left. I had enough, so I went over to ask if she needed any help loading things into her car, and she said yes. I started putting boxes in from the garage. I saw a poster of Sauron in one of the boxes, so we started talking about our shared love and obsession for Lord of the Rings. Then I asked where her boyfriend was, and she said, gone, without hesitation. I didn't push it. Once I had the last box in, I asked her if she had any more inside. She quickly jumped between me and the door inside and said, no, thank you, but that's all I have. I smiled and said, no worries, glad to be of help. I forced a calm, relaxed expression when I saw that her garage door leading inside was DIY locked from the outside. She got into her car and stared ahead, and all she said to me was, don't trust the police, don't trust the TV, and don't trust the animals. I felt a shiver run up my spine and quietly asked, what do you mean? She started her car and simply said, stay away from the mountain. She drove away and closed the garage as she went. I walked back to my house, and even as I write this, no one comes in or out of that house. In between then and last night, our neighborhood has been infested with coyotes, though not a single one has been seen. Strange police behavior, a strange accumulation of crows and helicopters that only ever come by at night, circling my neighborhood. But on to last night. Yellow's cat got out, and we were looking for him. We exhausted everywhere except the desert. Yellow wanted to go, but these few weeks have been creepy and stressful, and we're both small girls. So I agreed, but we were gonna go prepared. Me and Yellow went back home and got flashlights, backup batteries, 2 knives each, and my metal baseball bat. Yellow's boyfriend Green tagged along, which made me feel safer because he is tall and is the captain of the wrestling team. He brought a stun gun after we told him why we were prepared for the worst. So me, Yellow, and Brown went into the desert and searched for her cat. The entire time I couldn't stop staring at the mountain in the distance. After everything that has been going on, being in this area scared the living crap out of me. That is when we heard the meowing in the distance. It definitely sounded like Yellow's cat. The only issue is that it was coming from the direction of the creepy mountain. Yellow started to go in that direction. Green and I followed soon after. Yellow said something that I already assumed but wished was wrong. This is towards where me and Brown saw the tents. I started thinking the worst. We're gonna get killed, or we're gonna get sold into trafficking. My thoughts were going crazy, and my anxiety shot through the roof. That's when Green looked through his binoculars and said that he saw the tent. I quickly snatched them away and looked, and sure enough, 3 big military tents, and not far behind it was the mountain. If it wasn't for the lights in the camp, I wouldn't be able to see anything in the dark. I examined as much as I could. I didn't see a man circling, though I did see what looked to be a military truck pulling in, then 4 soldier-looking people hopped into the truck, and it went toward the mountain. The 3 of us just watched in the quiet and practically jumped to Mars when we heard a meow behind us. Sure enough, Yellow's cat was right there, happy and purring. We all collectively laughed at how silly we were, and then we picked up the cat and calmly went back home. On our way, we joked at how we had just stumbled on a military post, nothing else. We got home and the cat went and stared out the back door into the dark backyard, which I thought was weird, but then again, it's a cat and they do weird stuff all the time. I woke up to my mom yelling. Apparently, someone had gotten into the fridge and eaten tonight's dinner. She said it was an animal, but my dogs were in my room with me, so she assumed that it was the cat. Yellow shrugged it off and cleaned it up, but the weirdest thing was that it did look like the cat did it, as there was clumps of raw meat in his fur and around his mouth. But it looked like a bear had gotten into our fridge, and that the cat had just continued to stare out the window, only stopping about a few hours ago and sleeping. I got curious, and decided to walk out into the desert while it was day out. Safe, right? Well, that's what I thought, and I was wrong. I went with that baseball bat and Green's binoculars and followed the exact same path, and you probably guessed it. Not a single tent or sign of anything, but there was a coyote just sitting where the tents had been. It was staring up at me with strange eyes and a crooked face. I heard it howl, but I didn't see it howl. I took a step back, and it stepped forward. Then I booked it. I didn't want to be that dumb white girl in the horror movie who lingers around and gets killed, but running seemed like a scarier option. I sprinted all the way home with the sounds of growling and howling directly in my ear. I swear I could feel the breath on the back of my neck, but I never turned around. If I was gonna die, I was gonna die looking forward. As soon as I hit gravel, the noise stopped, and for whatever reason I immediately turned around, ready to swing with my bat, and all I saw was the back of a man walking back to the mountain with his hands in his long black trench coat. From behind I could see that he was bald and wore jet black sunglasses. His skin was pale as snow, and he wore a fedora-like hat on his head. I stared at him until he was gone, and not once did he turn around. I'm home now, more confused, more creeped out than anything else. I think I might investigate further, but I don't know. The desert is a scary place for me now. It used to be a place filled with peace and serenity, but since living out there for almost 30 years, you see things. This occurrence took place in the high desert of California in the early 1990s. The whole town was once all military. There's a military plant there and a prison, and the streets to this day consist of numbers and letters, for example, Avenue O and 178th Street. You always heard stories of people missing and underground tunnels, confirmed. In fact, a friend of mine kept getting a draft coming from his closet in his childhood home. Later, after he grew up, he checked it out and found an opening to one of these such tunnels. He called me over to check it out, but after I got there and we went through the opening, I was too freaked out to go more than 10 feet in when I turned around and told him that this might be how people disappear. You always saw things late at night, off in the distance far past the lights of that then small town. Strange, glowing, different colored lights that would move around low or zigzag, then shoot straight up. We saw things in the sky, just stuff you never talked about. Life was pretty carefree back then. If you wanted to visit friends, though, you would have to drive down long desert roads and sometimes end up coming home late at night in the pitch black because there were no street lights. I recall coming home late one such night with my boyfriend at the time and another friend, and we pulled over for some reason. Something compelled me to get out of the car and look up at the stars. We were in the middle of nowhere, but we could hear what sounded like machinery and muffled clanks like metal. We all started looking around but didn't see anything. Just then, we felt a vibration under our feet. I crouched down on the street to put my ear to the ground. It was coming from under us. We all listened intently and heard far down voices, but couldn't make out what was being said. We stood up and were discussing what it might have been when we saw a small red light on the horizon, and it was getting closer. We piled into the car and got out of Dodge. We only told a few friends, and they said that they had experienced the same thing. A year later, I told a friend that I started a small hauling business. Still, there was a big job, so I needed to borrow a trailer. He said he had a few that I could use, so I should come out to his property to check them out. It was just starting to get dark when he pulled out his new toy. It was a pair of military-grade night vision binoculars. He told me to wait until it got dark to leave, because he wanted to show me something creepy, and I was all in. Later we walked towards the back of his property, looking out at nothing, no lights, no roads, nothing but a barren desert. He pointed the binoculars east, and oh my. There were people coming out of the ground and moving around. I said, "What the hell am I looking at?" And he told me that his family called them ground dwellers, and that they are located in various parts of the desert. It gave me the heebie-jeebies. Needless to say, I never went to his house after dark again. At one point in my life, I lived in a mobile home park, a little past Avenue F. There was a massive treehouse in my yard that was left by a former tenant. The only way to get up into it was through a hole cut in the floor with a door on it, and under that was a rope ladder. One night I was sitting on the porch drinking a cup of tea when I heard something move up in the treehouse, and then a head popped up. It was a lady and her husband hiding. Clearly, I thought they were on drugs. I told them to come down from there, but they both refused. It wasn't until I threatened to call the authorities did they cautiously comply, looking all around, not wanting to be seen. By now, there's a small group of my friends and nosy neighbors gathering around. I saw that she was terrified by something, so I asked them to come in. I made them something to eat and waited for her to calm down. Then the lady reached in her bag and pulled out some papers. They looked like legal documents with government letterhead. There were drawings and schematics, and some of them even had embossed seals. I couldn't help but notice that they had water and smoke damage, and a few of them were burnt on the edges. She told me that they were checking out this place off of Barrel Springs Road, where there were 2 or 3 cinder block structures. I knew them well. A few years back I happened upon that place, and a black truck rushed down to greet me with guns drawn. She said the same thing happened to her, but she was in one of the structures, so she grabbed some things, and she and her husband ran. I went over these pages, and felt very uneasy reading them, like this was stuff that people get killed over if it got out. Stupidly, I said, "Why don't you just simply give them back?" She said that they had been running, and everywhere they stop a black car or van with government or no plates showed up with darkened windows and would just sit there watching them. Well, I really didn't want to get too involved, especially after reading what I did think was way too big for a little old me. I will take what I saw to my death, so I packed them lunch and told them that they could sleep in the treehouse for the night. They did, but they were gone early the next morning before I woke up. After that, we started seeing black vans parked on our lonely road, facing the house. At one point, I even walked up to them, but they took off as soon as I knocked on their blacked-out driver's door window. Lots of unexplained things happened out there in the desert that you don't see much of now. I think because there are more lights and people, well-lit towns, and camera phones pointing everywhere. There weren't cell phones to call for help back then. I remember one time a few years later, it was a fun day with some of my friends. We were in this stupid little red car called a Yugo that seemed to be on its last leg most of the time. My friend's uncle told him that there was a whole abandoned town far west of the Mojave Desert, and that there were things just left there all over the place. We were so dumb. It took us a long time to get out there, and if you asked me to try and find out how now, I don't know if I could. I wasn't driving. Thinking we were lost a few times, we started seeing things. A carnival ticket booth on a trailer, broken tractors and furniture, little shacks here and there, and empty water bottles all over the place. There wasn't a livable house or store or place of business for many, many miles. I wondered how anyone could even survive in a place like this, and then we saw it. It was a long and looked like single-wide mobile home, if you could ever call it home. It was between 60 to 50 feet long, and it was raised with the siding going all the way to the ground. It looked like something from a horror movie. It had several windows down the length of the house. Some of the windows had old frayed curtains still hung up and blowing in the desert breeze. There were open sections of missing siding, exposing the darkness underneath the structure big enough to step or crawl through. There were old, dusty cars with their doors and trunks open, trash and open cans all over, and a small fire pit in the middle of all of this. His girlfriend and I saw people that seemed to not be wearing any clothes that we could make out, but their bodies were skinny and didn't move like ours. They were inside that house and were watching us from the windows and from the open spaces underneath. They were following us, and as we slowly drove past, they went from window to window and open space to open space underneath. They were almost inhuman, and had big eyes and pale skin. Too pale for the desert. My friend the driver pulled up next to the fire pit, and despite us screaming to go, 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 he turned off the car. His girlfriend began to cry out that we had to leave then and now. He didn't see what we saw. He said, "Stop, babe, this stuff is so cool." Oh my God, I wanted to punch him in the face. We both kept looking at the people watching us while begging him to get back in the car and drive. He picked up a long bone off the ground and started to push the soot around the fire pit and said, "Hey, it looks like somebody cooked a dog." Just then he looked up. His girlfriend leaned over to the driver's seat and grabbed his jacket in an attempt to pull him back into the car when he finally saw what we were seeing and said, "Oh shit." That thing hiding under the house was swaying back and forth. His hands were on both sides of the opening, and he was staring at us almost with the intent to lunge. He tried to start the car, but it failed. Thinking that this was my end, that I was about to be eaten in the desert, I began to beat on the back of his seat, screaming, "Please, God, start." After 3 tries, it finally did. We tore out of there, leaving a huge cloud of dust. We pulled over far from that location and tried to compose ourselves. Never again. We didn't talk about what we saw after that. I think that we were in disbelief that it had even happened. There were so many crazy things that occurred in the desert back in those days. Too many to even come close to tell you. I know that there are things that we do not, or maybe will never, understand. I also know that there are more eyes now paying attention, so I don't think it will be too much longer before we all know the truth. A few years ago, my best friend Jay and I decided to start exploring in the desert near a tiny statutory town close to our hometown with an immense expanse of land and an adjoining wild horse preserve. We were hooked immediately, both of us people who enjoy hiking and camping. This place seemed like heaven. It wasn't long before we found an amazing little campsite about 15 miles or so into the desert, far away from any light pollution and even cell phone signal. It's the perfect place with a small reservoir used in the late summer to water free-range cattle, an old corral, and a fire pit carved into the sandstone. We decided we needed to go camping as soon as possible, and planned on having our first camping trip a few days later on my days off. Jay and his SO met me out there with our dogs, and the first day was a ton of fun playing around the book cliffs high above the Grand Junction and sighting wild horses. We returned to camp late in the afternoon, and had a nice time cooking dinner and telling stories around the campfire. Soon darkness fell, and I began to become aware that I had been feeling uneasy. Not wanting to ruin the fun for my friends, I told them I was tired and needed to turn in. I returned to my tent with my 2 dogs and snuggled in, the feeling of unease tightening around my shoulders. I couldn't shake the feeling of anxiety, so I did what I do best and chose to ignore it, turning on a movie that I'd downloaded on my laptop. As the intro played to my movie, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I paused the film and stared behind me. I saw what looked like the bobbing of a flashlight behind our camp near the dirt road. The light danced for a few minutes before disappearing. I looked beside me and saw that my dogs were still sleeping peacefully and chalked it up to my imagination before returning to my movie. I must have fallen asleep because it wasn't long before Jay's SO was waking me up and asking me to come help calm Jay down. When I left my tent, my friend was visibly upset and shaken. He kept apologizing and asking if we could leave. He said he didn't know what was wrong, but that he needed to leave, that we needed to leave now. I told him that I'd been feeling incredibly uneasy, and watched all night, and we agreed to go. Taking only our dogs and pillows, we left our campsite, and drove the long 30 miles back home in the middle of the night. The drive back into the town was nerve-wracking. I had to keep glancing in the rearview mirror to make sure that my friend's car was still behind me. It took everything I had to keep my vehicle under 20 miles an hour so that I wouldn't ruin my car on the heavily rutted dirt roads, but it felt as though we were being chased away. The next day, Jay decided to go back for our things. Both his SO and I had to work that day, so he drove out to the campsite in the early afternoon. Everything was as it should be. No animals had touched our stuff or even tried to get into the cooler. But he said that he still felt watched, and as if something wasn't right. A few weeks later, a friend of Jay's was in town visiting and wanted to go camping, so Jay took him back to the spot near the reservoir. He said he experienced the same feeling laying there in his tent, his whole body screaming out in anxiety. He said all of his muscles were tense, and he had the overwhelming feeling that if he were to close his eyes, that something horrible would happen. So he left his tent, not wanting to wake his friend, and decided to take a stroll around the campsite. Before long, he found himself down by the reservoir. This is when he saw a small but brightly intense light darting and dancing back and forth, tucked into the valley below the Grand Mesa, going from east to west. It darted and whirled around. He said the feeling of fear and unease was so intense that he went back to his tent without watching to see if the light went away. We have both had a handful of odd experiences out there following these incidents. I've taken several friends and family members out there to experience the beauty. One summer I was seeing a guy who was interested in checking out the area, so I took him to a spot where we could park my car and explore near the Twin Peaks. We started walking up an oil field admin road when I was overcome with the urge to climb up the sandstone rockfall at the base of the mountain. My friend followed me, and we hiked up until he found an opening to a cave. We peered in and found that the opening was more like a skylight. The bottom was a good 20 feet or so below us. We decided to look around and see if there was an actual entrance. After a bit of searching, we followed my dog to the entrance of the cave. It was low and slightly blocked off by fallen sandstones, so we had to get on our backs and inch in foot first. When we got in, we saw that we were only in a smaller antechamber, but the smell of something decaying and the feeling of unease we felt told us to leave, so we did. It was only after we got back into the car that I discovered I dropped my favorite vape. It's been 2 years since I lost it, but every time I'm around there, I have the overwhelming urge to return. On one occasion, my mom and I took our dogs out to the desert to run free. I took her to a cool rock outcropping that I call Castle Rock. We hiked up the rock structure and started to make our way around it when we noticed the base of this rock structure was littered with small bones of every variety. This creeped my mom out heavily, but I am sort of a goblin by nature, so I started picking through them for things to take home. My mom told me she didn't feel right and wanted to walk back down to the Jeep. I told her to please hold on a minute, that I'd been wanting to check this place out, so she stayed while I hiked up the right side of the structure. I found some cool rocks, took some pictures, and enjoyed the view from the top of the rocks before heading down. When I got back to my mom, she was extremely upset, saying that she had been yelling for me the whole time, and that she couldn't find me anywhere. I laughed her off and told her that I was thirsty, so we returned to her Jeep. As soon as we got in, we noticed a volleyball in front of her vehicle. It was maybe 3 feet in front of her Jeep right where we had walked past, with no footprints or any indication as to how it had gotten there. There have been several other strange occurrences, but nothing ever really seems to happen. Only eerie feelings, occasional lights, and the sensation that someone is watching you. But I always manage to convince myself that there really isn't anything going on, besides an overactive imagination, and I always return. I'm incredibly drawn to the area, like nothing I've ever experienced before. I've even taken a couple of solo camping trips, despite being a single female by myself. But I always return, even after promising my best friend and my sister that I wouldn't go out there alone anymore. I always do. Jay refuses to go camping out there anymore, and it takes a great deal of effort to convince him to go explore anymore. Despite the fact that he has hitchhiked from Michigan to Colorado, done solo backpacking and more, he can't stand it. Beside the feeling of being watched when I'm out there, the fixation bordering on obsession with this place kind of makes me nervous. I always feel like I'm searching for something when I'm out there, leading me to go to new places and check out new areas. I was a sergeant in the U.S. Army and getting out from the military when President Bush ordered more troops into Iraq in 2003. I had just returned home into Austin, Texas when I was called into my local National Guard unit at Camp Mabry and told that I was being recalled to the Army, but the unit was already tasked out to deploy to Iraq. I was not part of their unit yet, so the commander offered to give me a waiver to deploy with a government contractor, Halliburton, in Houston. I knew that I would make more money as a contractor, so I took the offer. Not long after arriving in Kuwait at Camp Doha, I began working with the operations team overseeing logistics affairs. We would oversee the daily convoy of supply between Kuwait and Baghdad, a route riddled with IED incidents, small arms skirmishes, and almost constant breakdowns of Army and civilian vehicles. Because I was an SAW gunner in the 1st Infantry Division while in active duty and was technically still in the Guard, I was often in the convoys manning a mounted weapon that accompanied the mostly civilian convoys. During these runs, we had a few strange encounters in an area south of Baghdad, known then as Camp Babylon. Occupied by French troops, but then designated an archaeological site for obvious reasons, Camp Babylon was set up in the area that was said to be originally inhabited by the famous Tower of Babel. Indeed, there were ruins there that did look like a massive structure once stood at that spot. I had 2 strange incidents happen to me while passing through there. The first incident seems to be a bit benign, but sets the mood for the second. We were passing through Camp Babylon in the afternoon one day when our convoy took small arms fire. The SOP at the time, standard operating procedure, was to stop the convoy and return fire. This was because in the past, such incidents ended up being a long gunman attempting to scare the convoy into running into IEDs on the road. Because of this, the standard operating procedure changed to stop the convoy, dismount, and return fire. While engineers looked for explosive devices on the road, we scanned the horizon for enemies. Nothing. They most likely fled immediately. However, the ruins around Camp Babylon were alive with shadow figures that seemed to move about the area. Several times we would spot the figures, but they would instantly disappear. A contractor lying beside me with his weapon commented how odd that we were in the shadow of Babel and fighting the supernatural. I didn't respond, but knew that he was a 32nd degree Mason who was really into the arcane aspects of Babylon, etc. I didn't feel at the time that much was supernatural, but certainly did see the shadowy and bizarrely small figures dart about the structures. Once the road was deemed clear, we continued on to Baghdad. The second incident occurred about a month later. At this point, the weather in southern Iraq and Kuwait had turned quite cold at night. During this encounter, we had just completed the supply run to Baghdad and were returning back to Camp Doha in Kuwait when a vehicle in our convoy broke down. Once again, we found ourselves right at Camp Babylon. While the army mechanics took a look at the vehicle and the rest of us took up fighting positions around the area, strange things began to occur. It started with a strange light bobbing in the desert. Thinking it was a person with a flashlight, we used night vision goggles to watch. It was simply a glowing ball of light moving toward a set of ruins. After initial contact with the light, a few of us had moved forward away from the convoy to see what the source was. After seeing it was self-contained and not a person, we were a bit alarmed. Then we all heard a sound that I will never forget. A long wailing began from one of the ruined structures and foundations not far away. It sounded like a woman in agony mixed with loneliness. On and on the sounds went while we huddled in the cold and dark, wondering what the hell we were listening to. With our night vision goggles equipped, we used our flashlights to spot the ruins. If you've ever done this, you'll know that a normal flashlight with NVGs looks like a massive beam of light. We scoured the area, but no source of the wails or the ball of light were seen. About this time we were told via radio that the vehicle was repaired and ready to roll, so we decided to return to the convoy. I was slinging my SAW over my shoulder when I noticed my contractor partner was staring at the ruins in horror. He was frozen. I shook him and he snapped out of his stupor, quickly leaving the area with the rest of us. Once we were back at the camp and it was pleasantly daylight the following morning, several of us were chatting about the encounter at Camp Babylon before our daily operations briefing. It was then that I remembered the terrified expression on the face of the contractor, so I asked him about it. He was still obviously traumatized by the event, but managed to explain that as we were leaving our position on the sandy hill, he saw a tall, black figure standing beside the ruins. It was watching us as we were looking for it. He said that he felt an instant wave of despair hit him and thought that he was going to die. He didn't even remember leaving the area. His next memory was in the Humvee, headed back to Kuwait. I now write non-fiction books about haunted places for Llewellyn Publishing and have visited hundreds of reputedly haunted spots. But I'll never forget the wailing figure at the ruins of Babel. It's also worth noting that when I related this story to some of our Pakistani employees at Camp Doha, they were also quite terrified. One of them, a translator we called Ardi, said that we had encountered a jinn, or a damned spirit, and that we were lucky to be able to tell the tale. I agree. I was in the Marine Corps from 2008 to 2012. I served as an infantry Marine and was stationed in 29 Palms, California. In 2009, while training for my first deployment, we went to a specialty school called Marine Corps Cold Weather Mountain Warfare School, which was located in Bridgeport, California. I enjoyed the 5-ish hour bus ride up Highway 395 through the Sierra Nevada mountains. I took in the beautiful scenery as my mind wondered about what I was in for, dreading climbing the 12,000-foot mountains that littered the landscape. Weeks of training go by. I was relieved to hear that we were moving to a place called Hawthorne to do some live fire exercises. It was about 30 miles away to the east back into the desert, an old out-of-commission army base that was deemed uninhabitable in the 50s for various reasons. I was enthusiastic to escape the bitterly cold temps up on the mountain. Slept on the ride there. Upon waking, I looked out the window and was shocked at what I saw. Remnants of the old base scattered the landscape. Halfway destroyed buildings, guard towers, and other typical military stuff that you'd expect to see. Behind that lied jagged lava rock mountains casting their shadows over the destroyed buildings. The place looked like a nuclear bomb had gone off nearby. Have you ever seen the old nuclear test videos from when it was first developed? They would stage a fake town to analyze what the blast would do. This place was like that, mixed with that game series Fallout and Chernobyl, if you've ever heard of that. As we drove in further, I noticed a bunch of mine shafts heading into the sides of the mountains. Now, I was very curious as to where we would be staying at. I was relieved to hear that there was a makeshift FOB. Nothing fancy by any means, just an old green tent for the NCOs and upper-ranking battalion staff. Us boots would be sleeping under the stars in the dirt. At least we had a makeshift Hesco wall around us to make things feel like home. During chow that evening, we were all sitting around talking. I asked my sergeant, what are all the mine shafts in the hillside for? He said they were munitions storage facilities as well as fallout shelter. The place was designed during the Cold War era, which made it super creepy. It's like all the people just decided one day to leave. Vehicles were still there, everything. It was strange. Night arrives. It was fairly hot out even though it was night as we were back down in the desert. I was having problems sleeping, even though I was just in my skivvies on top of my sleeping bag. Some of the others were awake talking, I could hear. I stared into the stars and mountains looming over me. It was a full moon that night with hardly any clouds. As I was scanning the mountaintops, which, if I had to guess, were around 500 to 700 feet above me, where we were all sleeping made it seem that I could almost reach out and touch the top. I saw something strange moving about at the peak. Figuring my eyes were playing tricks on me from extreme physical exhaustion and sleep deprivation, I disregarded it. Even later that night, I awoke to go take a pee. As I'm utilizing the head, I look up to where I saw something earlier. To my surprise, the strange, silhouetted figures were there, scurrying about the ridgeline. Now this has definitely caught my interest as my mind was wandering. Thankfully, I had a lot of cool stuff lying in my pack. Once at my gear, I grabbed my trusty PVS-14 night vision monocular. I bring them to my eye and look back up. Nothing? That can't be right. Like, huh? I swear I saw something. I look over to a buddy of mine that was awake and asked, "Hey, did you see anything up there?" He looks at me and says, "What are you talking about, bro?" I said, "Forget it." A few more hours go by through the night, and a loud crash comes from the closest mine shaft, which was located 100 feet or so from the FOB. Literally half the platoon sat straight up from a dead sleep. One of the sergeants screams from nearby and says it hit the rack. It was just some rocks falling, which made sense to most of us. The next morning, we woke up and did what we had planned to do for that day. Later that afternoon, we had some free time, and were creeping around checking the nearby buildings out. 4 of us decided to go down into a building. It was half above ground and half below. The wide staircase went down to open up into a larger cubicle-type area. Barely any light came through the small windows. I clicked on my weapon light and scanned the room. There were still papers and everything strewn about on top of the desks. We followed the hallway, which made a right turn. MOPP suits and gas masks lined the hallway, hanging on hooks. We see a sign above one of the doorways that said, "Girls' Locker Room." Us being the typical 19-year-old Marines that we were, we decided that we had to check that out. I took point and entered the pitch-black room. I was looking through the lockers to try and find something interesting when all of a sudden, the door behind us slams shut. We all ran like hell out the other door on the other side. A while back, I was chosen to be in an indie film about jinns, basically the local versions of demons. Before I continue, there are 4 things you should know about them. 1. It is said that they can take the form of animals and humans with circle eyes, literally circles for eyes. 2. They are supposedly born from smokeless fire. 3. They feed on energy, such as the energy you use to stay awake and the energy used to power electronics. And 4, an extra one. There are Christian jinns, Muslim jinns, you name it. They have their own free will, so everyone is different. Some are very nice, others not so much. So now for the tale. We were filming in the desert and a series of events started to occur. Right when we arrived, there was instantly a presence of something there. Then a knife, bent, twisted, with red marks, started appearing at my feet every 15 meters or so. Constantly, for the entire time that I was in the desert, this knife would follow me. 4 nights or so into filming, right as we were packing up, a loud screech could be heard. It was sort of a mix between a falcon, a wolf, and a mountain lion. It was later revealed to us by an expert of desert animals that there were no animals in the desert that made that sort of sound. On the 5th night, things began to get interesting. At one point we were sitting down taking a break when the sand just started to smoke. We thought that maybe a small plant had combusted because of the heat. After a minute or 2, the smoke stopped. We checked and there was no plant. We sat back down, and the second our butts hit the seat, boom, the sand all around the smoking area, and where the smoke had been, burst into flames, with 0 reasons to. Then, after that, all of our cameras started to lose their batteries very, very quickly. This was frightening because 1, it meant that we had to stay there longer, and 2, as mentioned in number 3 at the top, they feed on energy. The next night, albino scorpions, which are extremely rare, started sprinting toward the actors, literally going at full speed. We were forced to kill these rare creatures by burning them with a torch, and every time one died, 2 would replace it. Literally, 2 more would come out of nowhere, full speed ahead. This continued for several minutes. Things like this kept happening for the entire 2 weeks or so that we were at the site. When we finished filming, we split up for a bit to let the director edit some stuff. Then we had to film parts at a house. It is important here to mention that the movie was called 3 a.m. We were talking and one of the actors stated that since we had to split up, he had woken up at 3 a.m. every morning, his dogs going crazy, his alarm clock going off, and his AC setting itself to 3 degrees Celsius. 2 of the other actors revealed that the same thing had been happening to them. At the same time, I had never felt alone while I was in my room at night. Something was watching us. It followed us home. Since then, we have finished the film. I've started praying for protection every night based on the events that have happened. The actor who originally had the alarm go off at 3 a.m. moved to another house. Another actor moved to Canada. We were filming in UAE, which is in the Middle East, so this was pretty far away. A second actor also moved internationally, and I am moving in 4 weeks or so. I'm just hoping that it doesn't follow me home again. There are many stories from border crossers. Many people see ghosts and other things. I knew this one lady. She was a friend of my parents. She crossed to the desert to get to the U.S. She was with a group of people and the coyote led them. It was nighttime and the people rested. The coyote said to keep going because they'd lost a lot of time, so they got up and continued walking. Well, they came in front of this bushy-like place, and when you crossed, the tips of the branches caught your clothes. It was dark and hard to see, but they were in a line and followed each other. The lady I know was tired from walking just like everyone else was, but she said there was this old man next to her who complained about how he was in pain and just too tired to continue. Soon they passed by this trench. It was so dark that you couldn't see how far down it was before it stopped. They walked next to the trench, and the old lady told me that the bushes kept scratching her face and getting at her clothing. The lady then said that she turned around to look at the old man next to her and saw that he had tripped and fallen down in the trench, but he didn't make any noise. The lady got scared and panicked. She told her husband, and the husband told the coyote to stop, that a man fell in the ditch. The coyote had a flashlight and he shined it down into the trench, and it wasn't that deep. He went down with the flashlight, but he didn't see any man. The lady told her husband that she knew he was there. She said that he fell right in front of her. The coyote was getting impatient. He looked everywhere, but still couldn't see anyone. He never found the man, and obviously he couldn't have made it very far in such a short amount of time. I guess he thought that she was lying or something, and decided to keep on moving. Soon they crossed the desert safely and all. The lady said that she thought it was weird how he fell. She said that it was a trip, but it was like he was sinking in his fall. She asked the others if they had seen him fall, and they all said no. The lady never saw that old man in the group after that. I don't really like this story because it makes me think of what might have taken him. I also heard that there are giant bugs in the desert or something like that. My family visited her house. When she told us this story, I was super scared and kept thinking about it at night. There are many people crossing the desert that have seen dead people walking around and see weird things following them at night. On our way home from a camping trip, my family stopped by the Oak Springs Trilobite site to fossil hunt. If you don't know the southeastern Nevada desert, the attractions are low to moderately traveled, and you will often be one of the only visitors. This site in particular was empty, and we were the only people there. A 1/4-mile trail leads you to a shale deposit where you can sift through for fossils. Shortly after starting out, I heard a man call out conversationally. Not really shouting, but talking loudly enough to communicate with someone a distance away. I was facing west on a south-facing slope, and he sounded like he was down and to the left, closer to me than the highway. I paused and took a look around. There was no dust, or engine noises, or anything like that. No crunching of footsteps. Nothing. There were flies buzzing about, and I decided that a bug had just buzzed in my ear. A minute later, I heard another man call out, this time up the slope to my right. Probably just another bug. Sounds can get weird in rocky canyons, so it was no biggie. We came upon the site, dug around for about 30 minutes, and found a few unimpressive specimens, so we headed back for the truck. At this point, I had forgotten all about the voices. Driving away, I asked Hubs, "What did you think? Pretty cool?" I'm the rock hound, and never know if he's enjoying my hobby as much as I am. He replied, "Sure, yeah, it was actually pretty cool." Pause. But I kept hearing these voices, and I couldn't tell where they were coming from. He had a face shield up over his ears at the time, making it unlikely that a bug could have possibly buzzed in there. He said that he was hearing them on the way back to the truck, and heard them calling out at least 3 times. Caliente is nearby, and Pioche a ways further, and both towns have histories dating back to ye olde mining days, and Mormon frontiering. There are lots of railroad, gunfight, and native raid stories, and some weird Warren Jeffs type stuff. Not to mention Area 51 being sorta/relatively nearby. Now, we are both atheists and skeptics. We don't believe in ghost stories, and neither of us have ever had a paranormal experience. But this one has us scratching our heads. My wife is a travel nurse, and we've been living here in Gallup, New Mexico for about 3 months now. We actually only have a week left here, and I'm glad. From the first day we arrived, we felt like something was off. We thought maybe it was just being in a new place, though we haven't felt that way in our previous locations, and maybe because the desert is so radically different from what we're used to. Just a little bit about Gallup. The demographic here is a majority Navajo with some Zuni and Hopi people as well. Gallup is landlocked by these 3 reservations, and the nearest city is Albuquerque, which is about 2 hours away. Now, despite what I just mentioned, being a non-native here in Gallup is not a big deal at all. There's no radical tension issues that we've experienced during our stay. In fact, we've really liked the people we've met here. Yet there is a burning feeling inside of me, like I shouldn't be here, and that we need to leave. And my wife told me that she feels the same thing. As for psychics and feeling negative energy and all that stuff, I personally think it's probably just a bunch of hooey. That's not what I'm saying here. This is more like an instinct that we need to leave and not renew the contract here. And it is only in Gallup. We stayed in Ruidoso a few years ago and loved it there. We have traveled to many places surrounding Gallup and felt fine, but as soon as we came home from the trips, there was that feeling of something being not right.